I just returned from Israel, and friends, we got a lot to talk about. Israel is the most fascinating country in the world, and Jerusalem is the most exciting city on the planet. And we're going to be talking about that as well as the Sea of Galilee. So, today's program, we're going to talk specifically about my visit to Jerusalem. That'll be part one. And then later, we're going to release another part, another segment to the interview with Tom Short that'll include our discussions about our tour around the Sea of Galilee. So here we are with part one. That is my visit to the state of Israel and specifically our time in the city of Jerusalem. Well, hello, friends. Mark Harrington here, your radio activist, and I'm really excited about today's program. And if you've been following me on social media in the last several weeks, you know I took a trip to Israel. I took a tour to Israel and did my best to try to put that on social media without interfering too much with my own time there. I shot a lot of videos, posted a lot of pictures. And for those of you that didn't get an opportunity to see that, you can go to all of my social media platforms, Facebook, also our podcasting platforms, because I did interview a pro-life leader last week on the show from Israel. Hopefully you enjoyed listening to her and what we're up against there in Israel. But I wanted to take time because I've been unpacking my trip, not just literally from my suitcase, but I've actually been unpacking the trip in my mind and all the thoughts that I had when I was in Israel and since then. And I've put together some pictures and just trying to archive as best I can my experience. And as I was doing that, I'm thinking, this may be something that my viewers and listeners might be interested in actually learning from, because it's not all that often that we get a chance to go to the Holy Land. And so I'm hoping you're going to be encouraged by today's program as we kind of walk through my recent trip to Israel. And my guest today, and actually the leader of that trip, is Tom Short. And Tom has a ministry called Tom Short Campus Ministries. And I met Tom, and I don't know exactly the year, and I'm trying to recall. I know there might be some difference of opinion as to where I met him, but I met him in the state of Florida on a campus. He was doing his normal evangelism tours of college campuses, and of course, I was doing our pro-life outreach, and I listened to him and heard him on campus preaching the gospel. And I came up and introduced myself and found out he's from Columbus, Ohio, which is my hometown. How odd was that? And we've been friends ever since. And my wife and I wanted to go to Israel 3 years ago, and we couldn't because of COVID. Like a lot of us, we were locked down. We wanted to go for our 30th anniversary, and we didn't get to. And so we kind of put it on the back shelf until last fall, and we started thinking about going. And initially I was thinking, I'm going to plan my own tour. That's kind of how I do things. And then I remember that Tom leads a group to Israel. I thought, well, hey, let's check into that. And it just so happens there were a couple slots left, and my wife and I got on the tour and we went to Israel this time around, and we were very, very happy we did. And so, the people ask, have you ever been to Israel? Well, I was there 34 years ago. It's a long time. I actually went over there. I met my wife in Europe, and I proposed to her in Paris at the Eiffel Tower in 1989 in August. Pretty awesome thing. She said yes, thank God. And I went off to Israel for 2 weeks. But it's been 34 years since I was there. I was looking through my journal, and it said at the end of it, that is 34 years ago, at the end of the journal, it said, Paula and I will return in 2 years. Well, it's been 34, but we did get to return. And I'm glad we waited because it was well worth it, because Tom Short leads an amazing tour to Israel. And so what we want to do today is kind of go through that as best we can. We'll try to move through it as quickly as we can without missing too much, because obviously you can't do it justice. We're there 8 days. We're going to multiple sites per day. we're going to pick some of the high points, if you will, at least from my perspective. And we're going to get Tom's point of view and mine as well as we go. So, hey, Tom, I appreciate you taking the time to be on the program today.
So glad to be here. And I'm going to have to hear more about how you met your wife in Europe, but leave that for another time.
Well, I didn't meet her there. I had, we were dating before we got there, but yeah, that was quite a story anyway. Right. So it was a wonderful thing. And I would have loved to return 2 years later, but as the Lord had it, 34 years later, it worked just well. And I told you, Tom, you asked me how it went. I really think it was the best trip of my life. I'm 63. I've been around a while. I've done a lot of traveling. But I tell you this, it was life-changing for me, and I'm sure it was for a lot of the people on the tour. And so what I'd like to do is try to go through this as best we can from day 1 through day 8. We went to a lot of places. We flew into Tel Aviv, and then we all met in Jerusalem at the Olive Tree Hotel. And then the first day, we went out into, actually, we got a view of the old city, the first thing. And then we went to Bethlehem. And, I've not been to Bethlehem. I wasn't there 34 years ago. So this was a new experience for me. The first thing that struck me is that you had to go through a checkpoint, that this is a place that's, if I understand correctly, it's part of the West Bank. The Muslims control it. And Bethlehem, the city, is in Muslim territory. So our tour guide couldn't make it. He had to step outside the bus, if you remember. But we went to the Church of the Nativity. I had not been there. And if you would, Mr. Producer, pop up that picture. This is where it is claimed that Jesus was born. So if you would, Tom, you shared a little bit there. Our tour guide did as well. What impressed you the most about the Church of the Nativity and being there in Bethlehem?
This is a church that is the oldest functioning church in the world.
Yeah.
And that's quite a thought, that it has been functioning as a church for over 1,500 years at that location. It's gone through quite a bit, of course, with the Holy Land has, seen wars, seen conquest by Muslims, and then the Crusaders, and it's gone back and forth. But the oldest church. Now, can I mention, if maybe I could, about these spots? Like, was this the actual spot Jesus was born? It's very interesting how we don't know for sure, but there's a lot of reason to think so. The reason is that after that, first 100 years or so, the Christians would talk about these places. And in 135 AD, the Roman Emperor Hadrian, who hated the Christians, came and he found out where the Christians thought, like, Jesus was born, crucified, so forth. And when he found those places, he built a pagan temple right on top of them to desecrate those spots. Right. Well, it was later on, after Constantine was converted, his mother-in-law, she came and tore down those pagan temples and built Christian churches on top of it. So there's reason to believe these are the spots. We don't know exactly, but there's solid traditional reason on both sides. Those who hated Christ and those who loved Christ came to those.
And if you're watching the program, you can see the picture of me looking at the star. Explain that site, Tom. It's kind of unusual. It's underground, right? I mean, it's under the, I don't know, you wouldn't call it the pulpit of the church. Explain what we're looking at here.
Well, would it be in Nazareth, people had caves that they would stay. There were caves there, and their homes would be built over caves. And lots of times these caves areas would be where their livestock were kept. And so it's believed that Jesus actually was the manger, and the birth Mary was actually in a cave system. Right. And that would have been where that is. They think the spot. You see, on that star, there are 14 points, which represent the 14 generations found in Matthew chapter 1, from Abraham to David to the captivity, and then to Jesus.
Yeah, so that was our first stop, the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. Again, that was and we all sang in that cave. Remember that? I forget what song we sang. Do you
We
remember?
might have sang "Oh Holy Night." I believe
That
we
was it.
sang. Yeah, and one thing we love to do there is sing, because like when you're
Mhm,
down a cave, the acoustics are unbelievable as it
mhm.
resonates through that whole area.
And then we left and we went to the shepherd's field. Explain what that was. Now, I don't have a picture of that. The next picture will be of the shrine of the book. But
Yeah.
as we left, we went out to the shepherd's field. What was that all about?
Well, that's the place traditionally believed where the shepherds were keeping watch over their flocks by night, and
Mhm,
would have gotten the message from the angels to come,
mhm.
and that there's a child born and to come worship him. It's, you're standing right at the place. Again, we don't know is that exact, but probably wasn't far away. It may have been within a quarter mile. It might have been right on the spot. But these are the places where, well, not only the shepherds, but that's where David would have
David.
grazed his sheep, and some of the thinking that went into his Psalms and some of his testing as a young man right there in Bethlehem, as well.
Isn't that where it's believed that he took on Goliath too?
No, that's at
Or is
Elam,
that somewhere else?
the
Where
Valley
is
of
it?
Elam, yeah, which is
Okay,
over closer to Jerusalem.
I
Yeah,
must not have been paying attention that morning.
we did we did,
Anyway,
we did not go to the spot where David fought Goliath, but maybe
okay.
one of these years.
Well, again, another, we started the tour out in the right way, obviously going to the birthplace of Christ. And then we went to the Shrine of the Book, which is where the Dead Sea Scrolls are kept. This is at the Israel Museum. And if you're watching again, you can see there's a picture of me in front of it. It looks like a giant plunger. Honestly, it's not. It's the lid to a clay pot. That's what it's supposed to resemble anyway. But this is where the Dead Sea Scrolls are kept. Explain those, and we're going to get into Qumran as we get later into the program. But the importance of the Dead Sea Scrolls.
They were discovered in a cave up in an area called Qumran, beginning in about 1947 by a shepherd boy who was looking for a lost goat. And he
Mhm.
discovered them in this cave. It turned out to be one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of all time, because these were scrolls that were copied by Jews known as the Essenes, who had separated themselves. They believed the everything becomes so corrupt. They had isolated themselves and were waiting for the coming of the Messiah and his judgment. While
Mhm.
there, they copied scrolls of the Old Testament and other important writings to them, and they hid them in these caves. And this was pre-Jesus. These were BC, and they were discovered almost 2,000 years later. And we find that they included copies of the Old Testament that people had wondered for years. Had the Old Testament changed through the years? We had hundreds and hundreds of years with no, from when it was written to the oldest manuscripts, people thought it would have changed. But when we discovered these old manuscripts, they discovered it hadn't changed. So a strong apologetic for our confidence in the validity of the credibility of the scriptures.
Yeah, and interesting there as well is that they were discovered in 1947, right? 1 year before the recognition of Israel as a nation. Isn't that right?
Correct. Had they been discovered 100 years later, you wonder if they would have ever even seen the light of day, because they're so critical to even to show that Israel has a right to this land, because it shows that God gave them in the Old Testament scriptures. God gave that to them, and that might have never come to the light of day had these been discovered at another period of time.
So that was day one. So let's move to day two. We went to the city of David. Again, 34 years ago, I wasn't there. Frankly, I don't know how much excavation was done at that time. But what intrigued me so much about the city of David is that it's so far down underneath all of what's there currently, as you can imagine. Centuries now have passed where Jerusalem's been destroyed and rebuilt, destroyed and rebuilt, destroyed and rebuilt. And what you see currently today in contemporary Jerusalem is not what it looked like way back in the day. So the city of David, explain some of the impact there, and the pool of Siloam, which I thought again was a really powerful apologetic to the fact that the Bible is true, and and reliable.
So there would have been no excavations of the city of David when you were there 34 years ago.
Is
This
that
has all
right?
been in about the last 20 years that
Mm,
all of this is, and it is the number one archaeological site in Israel today, as I understand it. What you're
mhm.
looking there is called the Canaanite Cave, which was a
Yeah.
way that they traveled in and out of the city underground years ago. As you mentioned, in those days when a city would be destroyed, they would just tear everything down and then they just build on top of it. And so archaeological discoveries, you go down, like there's several civilizations buried underneath the city of Jerusalem because it goes
Mhm.
back in time well over 3,000 years. And
Right.
so this is a cave called the Canaanite Cave that is one of the ways it would have been into the city, a secret way into the city. Well, about 3,000 years, well, not quite 3,000 years ago. The city of David, now keep in mind, the Bethlehem is sometimes called the city of David, but that's not what we're referring to.
Right.
Here we're talking about where David came and established his palace, and it was just south of what is where the temple would be built. The
Mhm.
temple was built, we may talk about this in a minute, but so many things happened there. That's where Abraham offered up Isaac. That's where then the temple was built. And it was also where Jesus was crucified, all in this Temple Mount area. And so David's palace was just south of there. And but then he built the temple up there. You asked
And
about the
then the
pools. Oh,
Pool of Siloam, which I felt was, again, very, interesting. Tell us some recent news about the Pool of Siloam.
well, so a lot of what is the archaeological treasures, as we said, it's buried um, underground.
Mhm.
And Jerusalem, as we know, is a city that's quite contentious. There is the Arab part called East Jerusalem that
Mhm.
Arabs they live there, and then there's
Right.
the old city and modern Jerusalem, which the Jews have control of. Um, they realize that many of the archaeological treasures are in this Arab area, and so Jewish people have tried to raise money to buy their homes and then be able then to excavate and search underneath. Finally, after quite a while, a number of areas were bought right there. What's called the Pool of Siloam, and it's now being excavated. Just started weeks before we got there. The Pool of Siloam was where Jesus healed a blind man, and it's also where what's known as the Gihon Springs, which provided water to Jerusalem and were redirected when they were about to be besieged by the Babylonians. It was redirected so that the water would come into the city so that they wouldn't all die of thirst when the enemy besieged the city. And that's just one of the engineering marvels of ancient history is known as Hezekiah's Tunnel. We didn't go through it because it was a little chilly that day, and so we decided not to. And it rained quite a bit the week before. But I've been through it a couple times before, and it's an engineering marvel because they redirected the water that was flowing out of the city to flow into the city so that they would have a source of water once the enemy came to besiege them.
My guest is Tom Short, and you can find out more by going to tomthepreacher.com. And we're talking about our Israel trip that I just took with my wife and part of his annual tour to Israel. And I exhort you folks, if you're interested in going to Israel, you need to get on Tom Short's tour here. He already has dates for next year. And I'm thinking, boy, I really want to come back. I don't want to take up a seat of somebody who hasn't gone yet, but I would love to return to Israel, and I'm planning on it someday. But those
If I
dates are
could, oh,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Go ahead. No,
Well,
go
I was just
ahead.
going to say that we have not updated our website for next year yet.
Right, right.
So it has a pretty similar itinerary, but the dates would be
February
February
7th
7th
through
through,
15th.
yeah, I'm
15th.
sorry.
Yeah. No. Listen, folks. I mean, I can't recommend it more highly because not only just the history and all the Bible sites and everything you learn when you go to Israel, but the guide Ishai, it was awesome. I hope you get him again next year. Really, I could sit and listen to him for days. Frankly, I mean, I just pouring out just so much information and knowledge, and what a great guy. And of course, you, Tom. I mean, we say that the Bible comes alive in Israel. We understand that the Bible's already alive. We understand that. And I like the way that you kind of characterize it. And you've said this, that, you think about the Bible, it might be just in black and white, but when you go to Israel, it's like color and HD.
Yeah.
It just really does bring so much home. Even now, as I read the scriptures, I'm like, oh yeah, I was there. It just adds a whole nother layer of understanding, and I guess really strengthens your faith. So let's move to day 3. It's going to take us a while to get through all these days, but I'm enjoying the walk through our time together. So we went to the Mount of Olives on day 3. Who can? You can't go to Israel and not go to the Mount of Olives. Well, of course, so much happened there in Jesus's ministry. And by the way, the title of the trip to Israel was Walking in the Footsteps of Jesus. So Tom made it a purpose to try to look at the specific things that Jesus did in the Holy Land and try to go to as many places as Jesus did, because there's a whole lot of other stuff to see in Israel, and I'm glad that that was the focus. And of course, the Mount of Olives is a place that you must visit. And so, Tom, I want to talk about that a little bit. Just the Mount of Olives, number 1. We're going to look at Gethsemane as well, the Via Dolorosa, the Garden Tomb. But first of all, let's talk about the Mount of Olives. And folks, again, if you are watching this, you'll see there's a picture of me looking at the old city at sunset. I can tell you there has never been a more impactful time in my life to be able to sit there and just take an hour or two, look at it, contemplate what Jesus went through in that last week of his life, read the Bible. I mean, to me, it's just like one of those moments that you'll never, ever forget. So, Tom, we went to the Mount of Olives at the first. We went to the top, got a kind of a great view of the city from the Mount of Olives, which is where, Jesus would have also seen. Then we went to Gethsemane. Tell us about and you spoke at Gethsemane. Tell us about Gethsemane, and then I want to talk about the Via Dolorosa.
Well, of course, Gethsemane is where Jesus faced a tremendous test.
Yeah.
What struck me is that Jesus had so many opportunities to escape what he knew was coming. And at Gethsemane, when the word means olive, it means olive press. And of course, Jesus was pressed in his soul so much that he, as he's praying, he sweat great drops of blood. I think this, right. What was it that Jesus was feeling there? Believe it or not, I don't think it was the pain of crucifixion that was weighing on him so deeply and distressing him. And actually the scripture says it was that he was terrified. Can you imagine Jesus? He was terrified at what was going on that night. And I think what it was he realized he was going to be bearing the wrath of God, the cup of God's wrath. He said, Father, let this cup pass from me. He was going to bear our sins and your sins. And to me, that's the awesome of Gethsemane, to consider what he did there. And it was a terrifying thought, but what he endured for us.
Right. And of course, at a lot of these sites, there are churches currently. This church is called the Church of All Nations. A lot of them Catholic churches. And, I'm not Catholic, obviously, but I'm thankful that the Catholics put churches on some of these locations because they staked out the ground. Otherwise, who knows what would have happened to it, over the years in that. But then we went from there. So you got the Mount of Olives, and then you go through the Kidron Valley, up the hill into the old city, into the Via Dolorosa. Take my viewers and our listeners through that walk.
And of course, before we got there, we were the pools of Bethesda. I know we can't talk about everything, but I mentioned earlier that we like to sing, and the pools of Bethesda were the 5 porticos. And this is again we know that this was the spot. We asked earlier, do you know a certain place is the actual spot? Well, archaeology confirms that the man who said, I'd like to be healed, but when the waters are stirred, I can't get in them. Some others get in before me, and Jesus healed the man right at this spot. We know that was it because archaeology confirms that spot.
But it's on the same basic pathway of the Via Dolorosa, the St.
Yes.
Anne's Church and the Pool of Bethesda.
Yes. And so this
But take us through
follows.
the 7, is it 7 steps to the Via Dolorosa, is that correct, or
Well,
is there more?
the Catholics have about 14. I believe there are,
Okay. Oh,
I've forgotten exactly. I think there's 9 in the Bible.
Okay.
And several have, but this is basically the walk of Jesus being from Caiaphas's house.
And
And
tell us
then
what gate do we go through? Is it the new gate?
I'm forgotten.
Because you got the eastern gate is the one that is shut, that the Muslims
Yes,
closed up,
that's
right?
where he's going to come back.
And that's where the
But
Muslim
this is
cemetery is
where
nearby.
through Kidron we go through the Lion's Gate.
Okay, Lions Gate. That's right.
Yes,
Okay.
so Kidron into
There
the
you go.
Lion's Gate, and then you go. It leads into the Muslim quarter where we have Bethesda and the
Mhm.
Church of St. Anne's, where it's incredible acoustics and we sing.
Mhm.
And then from there, the Via Dolorosa is basically the walk of Jesus from his trial before Pilate, and then on to Herod, and as he's taken step by step, all the way to Golgotha, and that would be the final step in the Via Dolorosa.
And it ended up at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And of course, and I don't want to get too far into this, but there is a dispute as to where Jesus was crucified, where he was buried, and where he was resurrected. I think you agree with me that the Garden Tomb's probably the authentic location. We'll get to that in a second. But either way, along the way, there are different. The stages of the cross are put on the wall in stone, and you can stop along the way. And of course, during Passion Week, that is reenacted every year. And we went along that to the Via Dolorosa. And then, if I'm correct here, again, I'm trying to piece all this back together. I think we ended up at the Garden Tomb at the end of the day. Is that right?
Correct.
Or not? Okay, so
Yes.
let's talk about that. Let's talk about the Garden Tomb and what you shared with us and why you think that is the authentic burial place of Jesus, crucifixion grounds and burial place of Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Well, again, we don't know for certain. And what I would say is I'd like to believe this is the spot because it has not been developed.
Agreed.
And it really reminds you of what it very well could have been like. There's a place there when they crucified, they didn't put it up on a hill, but Golgotha, there's a place there in the
Right.
Garden
Go to
Tomb.
the Mr. Producer, go to the next picture because I want to talk about Golgotha. I've got a photo of the side of that hill. Go ahead and explain what people are seeing on the screen here.
Now, I don't know if you can see 2 eyes right there, right in the middle.
Yeah.
And the nose actually fell off during an earthquake here about 100 years ago. But this looks like a skull. This looks like a face. And when you look at it, particularly if you would have seen pictures from 100 years ago, it really looks like a skull, which led explorers about 100 years ago, 150 years ago to wonder, could this be the real Golgotha? Then they found, not too far away, they found an empty tomb that really could have been and seems to fit the descriptions of the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. We can go in this tomb. We can see where it's very possible that Jesus Christ laid for 3 days before he rose from the dead, which I might add is quite an experience to stand at that spot. Few other greater spots in the world to stand at than I can't think of a more important spot. And so some of the archaeological discoveries and then the locations where the Bible says that the cross was and the tomb was fit with the biblical description. So traditionally it's thought that the place of the cross and the burial of Jesus was in what's known as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And there's a reason to believe that. Primarily, like I said, tradition, as I explained earlier with Hadrian and Constantine's mother-in-law. On the other hand, this more recent discovery very well could be the place. And whether it is or not, it would depict what it would have been like in those earlier days, in the time of Jesus.
And friends, if you're looking at the photographs, it's what's really interesting about this is that the the place of the skull is right next to a bus station. That's it just seems kind of odd, but it's not far outside the gates of the city. In fact, Damascus Gate is right there, which would have been, of course, the gate that's there today is not the gate that Jesus would have passed through. That's about 20 feet below, which has been excavated, and you can see it right there. It's likely that Jesus passed through those gates up to the Garden Tomb and to this place called the Golgotha, the place of the skull. So it was outside the city. And explain, Tom, why the Romans wanted to when they crucified a criminal, they did it close to the city gates. For what reason?
Well, they wanted people to see it.
Mhm.
The crucifixion was meant to be a statement. You don't want to be like this guy.
Right.
If you follow him, you could end up like this. And it was meant.
Right.
I mean, when we execute a person, we make it really quiet and hidden, and we inject them with something that makes them fall asleep. We make it very, very gentle as much as you can. When they did it, they made it as terrible as it could be, because their executions were meant to scare and terrify the people. And so when you're walking by, this is on the road to Damascus and leaving Jerusalem to Damascus, a well-traveled road. And as people would walk by there, they're seeing those that are crucified really pretty much at eye level, maybe just a few feet above. They're not way up on a hill where you can't see them. You can see them vividly. You can see their eyes, their face. And of course, they're hanging there naked, shamed, embarrassed. And it's a statement that you don't want to be like this guy. Hey, let me add the reason for the bus stop here. This is actually an Arab Muslim territory.
That's
And
right.
they don't really like the idea that Jesus was crucified. They don't agree with that. And they don't like that this place is seen as that. And so they're not, the Garden Tomb has tried to purchase this area and tried to make this part of it. They won't let them. And when I've been there in the past, up at the top, there have been big signs about Islam that anyone looking at it, it would basically, there's only one God, and Muhammad is God's messenger. These big signs were there. So the bus is below, the signs were above, but Golgotha's right in the middle.
Yeah, and I remember asking you, why hasn't someone tried to reconstruct the skull to make it look a little more like a skull? And that was the answer, is that the Muslims don't want anyone to do that
Right.
because they don't want to give any more evidence to Christianity than is already there. So that's the Garden Tomb. I have to say, the Mount of Olives and Garden Tomb are the two places that I find, for me personally, I was able to take some time. As you know, Tom, we spent 2 extra days there, my wife and I. And I was able to go back and revisit both of these locations, and a great place to just take some time for devotions and prayer. What a beautiful location. What a wonderfully quiet spot. And like you said, you kind of hope that this was the location, because it seems fitting that our Lord would be crucified and buried and raised from the dead there. So that's day 3 in Jerusalem. I'm talking to Tom Short, and you can find out more by going to Tom the Preacher. We're talking to TomThePreacher.com. We're talking about our trip to Israel and the tour that he led as part of his ministry. We're trying to go through this day by day. So let's go to day 4. And again, I'm going off memory mostly here, Tom, but if I recall, I believe we began with the Western Wall and the Wailing Wall. If you would explain, there's a picture right on the screen here kind of showing that with the Dome of the Rock in the background. If you would explain, what is the Western Wall, which, first of all, I didn't realize there was a difference between the Western Wall and the Wailing Wall until I went there. I've always thought they were one of the same, and they are connected, of course, but explain what we're looking at here.
Well, this is as you can see up at the top, is the Dome of the Rock, which is a very holy place for Muslims. Now,
Right.
Jerusalem is not in the Quran, but they believe that Muhammad ascended to heaven from there and got visions from this spot, from a rock there. And so they built this great temple on the spot where they built their great mosque on the spot where the temple once stood. It's called the Dome of the Rock. and the
Yeah, and I have
outhouse.
other pictures of that, so we're gonna talk a little bit more about, but if you would talk about the wall there right to the left, the lower part is the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall.
Yeah. And so this would have been the foundation of the Temple Mount. Of course, when in 70 AD, the temple was destroyed as Jesus had prophesied and said in Matthew chapter 24 that there would be times of destruction. He wept over Jerusalem at the
Mhm.
destruction that was going to come. And indeed, the Roman legion came and totally destroyed the city. The entire temple, every stone was torn down. But this wall that you see is the foundation, shall we say, upon which the temple would have been built above it. And this would have been all that would remain of for Jews of a holy spot, shall we be, because the temple's destroyed, but these bricks remain as the foundation of where the temple once, the mount that upon which the temple stood.
Right, and I had the opportunity, as did many of us, to pray there. You have to put on a head covering. I just put my baseball cap on. It went up, and you can write a little prayer on a piece of paper and stick it into the cracks between the stones. I wrote 2 prayers. One was that Jesus would reach Israel and convert Israel, and then the other was that there would be an end to abortion. And I put those in the in the Wailing Wall, and we pray that God will honor that. Of course, it's a fascinating location because that's where mostly, and not all just Orthodox Jews, but that's where they go each day. Now, why do they wail? Why is it called a Wailing Wall?
Well, I might let you answer that one.
Well, I think I know the answer.
Yeah.
It's because they're wailing over the fact they don't have a temple
Yeah. Yeah.
to worship in, or to that this is all they have left.
Yeah.
So, I mean, a lot of people are thinking that there will be another temple. I'm not going to go down that road right now. I think that's something we could talk about on another day. But let's go to the next photograph. This is a picture of the Dome of the Rock. I'm sorry. Oh, no, here it is. This is a picture of the Southern Steps. I don't know if we went directly there from the Wailing Wall or not, but the Southern Steps, this was a very powerful moment of the tour, Tom, for me. You were able to preach from there. Explain your message, because I really was taken by this time and this view.
Yeah. So much happened here in these Southern Steps. These were the steps leading from the city of David up to the temple. When in the Psalms, where you have the songs of ascent, they would sing those as they walked from the city of David up to the temple. This was also the place where many rabbis would have their students gather around them, and they would talk. It's very likely the place where Jesus cried out his 8 woes unto the Pharisees. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. One of his condemnations, he said, you're like whitewashed sepulchres, outwardly beautiful marble, inwardly dead men's bones. Even so, likewise, outwardly you appear righteous to men, but inwardly you're filled with all greed, lust, hypocrisy, and so on. Now, if you'll notice, you can't quite see it but behind here is the Mount of Olives.
Producer, you could zoom in on the Mount of Olives behind me, if it's possible. There you go.
That's the Mount of Olives, and you can see up there towards the left, those are whitewashed sepulchers. That cemetery is 3,000 years old. Now, not everyone born there, not everyone buried there is from 3,000 years, but there are people there who were born from or buried there 3,000 years ago. Obviously, they would have been there when Jesus was rebuking the Pharisees. And now there's about 150,000 people buried on that mount. But you see, when Jesus would have called them whitewashed sepulchers, just right off there to us, you just turn your head to the right and you say, is that what he's referring to? It probably is. You see how it made that claim just seem like, oh, I see why he said that now. Made it come alive in a fresh way.
Yeah, and also you shared that this might have been the location to which Jesus was speaking with the rabbis, right? When he was 12 years old. I thought that was another insight that was interesting.
Yeah.
Share on that.
What's interesting, it says that when Mary and Joseph left and Jesus wasn't with them and they came back, when he was age 12 and they found him, it said he was seated with the rabbis asking and answering questions. An interesting thing about Jewish tradition, the teacher would be seated and the learners would be standing around asking questions and interacting with him. And just an interesting point there that says Jesus was the one seated at age 12 teaching, very likely right on these very steps. That was what happened right there.
And his answer to his parents when they tried to figure out where he was and came and found him is that I had to be about my Father's business. So what a powerful moment. Well, everybody, I hope that you enjoyed our talking about our trip to Israel with Tom Short. It was hugely impactful for me. I hope you enjoyed us going through that day by day. This was part one, which was our visit to Jerusalem. Later on in the next weeks or so, we're going to be releasing part two, which will be our time in the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus spent the majority of his life and the majority of his ministry in that location. So you've been listening to your radio activists on the Mark Harrington Show. You can find out more by going to markharrington.org. We'll see you next time. God bless you. God bless America. And remember, America, bless God.
You've been listening to Mark Harrington, your radio activist. For more information on how to make a difference for the cause of life, liberty, and justice, go to createdequal.org. To follow Mark, go to markharringtonshow.com. Be sure to tune in next time for your marching orders in the culture war.